Hey guys, we're back with frequently missed questions, and this is for chapter 2. Again, in these videos, I go through the most commonly missed questions from each chapter and talk about each of the answers, why it was correct, why it wasn't correct, and also give you some tips on how to study for them in the future. All right, so the first question I actually want to go through is this one. A researcher is interested in whether moods vary by day of the week. She codes the postings on thousands of Facebook pages to see whether people express more positive comments on some days than others. Which research method has she used? So you guys answered a variety of different questions here, but the top two are archival analysis and correlational method. The correct answer is actually archival analysis, but these two are easily confused, and I'll talk a little bit about what the difference is here in a second. So the part that we want to pay attention to this question is we've got two different variables here. We've got moods and days of the week, okay? And then we've also got the way in which she collects the data. And in this particular question, the way in which she collects the data is the important and defining characteristic here. She's coding postings on thousands of Facebook pages. So that data is already existing, and she's just going through a big archive of data in order to make conclusions about this data set. So because we do have two different variables here, it could be considered a correlational design, but really the better answer here is the archival analysis because we're looking at already existing data. If she were to go out and survey people on different days of the week, that could have been a survey type method, but really she's not asking people to fill things out and turn them back into her. She's just really looking at what they're spontaneously doing all by themselves. So our next question is talking about the observational method. The question is, the observational method is best at answering which of these questions? So if I were to approach this question, I would look at first my definition for observational method. Observational method is just when you're observing. So I always like to think of the O in observe and the O in only, as in you're only looking at one group. Okay, so the observational method here is, I like to think about the researcher far away from the group that they are studying and just looking at their behavior, not interfering with it in any way, and just observing one group of people. So observing, only, and one are the ways that I remember that because they all have O's. The correct answer is this top one at 42%, how polite are people in public places? And we know that because this is only looking at one group of people. This second answer here, are people from the southern United States more polite in public places than people from the northern United States? There we're looking at a comparison. So that would be a correlational design. What makes people act politely or rudely in public places? Since we have the word makes here, anything that looks at causality or causal type languages, A causes B, that kind of thing, that was always going to point toward a experimental design. And then this last answer here is more typical of a correlational method. So does music played in department stores influence how polite people are in those stores? It's not really talking about causing there. It says influence, but we can assume that that's social influence, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we are assigning people to condition and then looking at their responses. We're really just looking at, is there any relationship between the music played in department stores and how polite people are in those stores? So that would be a correlational design. And actually, this second question right after this, most commonly missed one again, is the correlational method, and it actually gives you the exact same answers as before. And we just looked at why music played in department stores influencing how polite people are is the correct answer there. Again, this is a correlational method. Our two variables that we're looking at the relationship between are music played and how polite people are. If there was only one variable, so if we go back to how polite are people in public places, that could be an observational design. But that's the difference between those two in these examples. All right, so our next question here is, suppose a researcher found a strong positive correlation between the number of tweets people send each day and their reported happiness. Which of the following is the best conclusion he or she can draw from this finding? So here we're looking at a correlational design. They tell us so in the question. In correlational designs, we can't make any assumptions about causation. I'm sure you guys have heard before, correlation does not equal causation. And that basically means that just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes one or the other, causes or makes something else happen in that relationship. So the correct answer here is happy people are more likely to send a lot of tweets than sad people. That's the kind of language that we would use if we were looking at correlations. You could talk about a third variable that makes people happy and sends a lot of tweets, but ultimately we're not looking at an experimental design. We can't say that the tweets are making people happy or the happiness is causing tweets. So there's really no need to talk about a third variable in a correlational design. Feeling happy makes people want to tweet more. Again, we don't know what's causing the happiness or what's causing the tweets. That would be answered by an experimental design, and this is only correlational. And again, sending tweets makes people happy. The key word here being makes. We know that that's not correct because makes or causes or leads to is often a word that's used when we're describing experimental designs instead of correlational. All right, so our next question is talking about internal and external validity. Social psychologists often do experiments in the laboratory instead of in the field in order to increase internal validity, which is the correct answer. It's that first one at the top. So it looks like a lot of you guys got this right answer, but some of us are mixing up internal and external validity. And a couple of us are actually responding with the meta-analysis answer. Just a little note about meta-analysis. We know that this isn't the right answer because a meta-analysis is basically sort of a study of studies. So we're taking all of the data from other sources, other published papers, and looking at the data in a new way and concluding different things based on those data. So this isn't really a study we would run in the lab. It actually just is sort of me sitting in front of my computer for a couple years trying to figure out what all of the data that everybody else has already collected means. So if we're looking at the difference between increasing internal validity and increasing external validity, I always like to remember these as the difference between internal being inside and external being outside. So if I want to increase internal validity, I would need more control in my study. So, for example, if I wanted to do a study about jealousy, I could bring my participants into the lab and make them jealous over something very specific that I have picked out. And that would mean that I have a lot of control over what they're getting jealous about, when they're exposed to the stimuli, and I can record their responses a lot more accurately than if they were just out in the real world getting jealous about whatever people normally get jealous about. Now, if I were to do a study like that, where I had people just report different incidents of jealousy that occurs naturally throughout their day, that would be a pretty externally valid study. So external being outside. When I remember these, I honestly think about it as internal being inside the lab and external being outside of the lab. Again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but for the purposes of studying for this test, it's a good way to think about these two things. Okay, so some overall tips on how to think about this chapter, or maybe how to study more effectively for this chapter, are to generate some examples of each of the methods. Now, I've given you a couple of them, but it's actually going to help you remember better if you can generate your own, so that you can look at why each example that you came up with really fits the criteria. And if you guys have any questions about, like, does this example I've generated work, please let me know, because I can help you fix those really easily, rather than when it comes time for the test to be tripped up there. Also use some of the memory tips that I explained earlier in my video. So for example, thinking about things like internal and external as inside the lab and outside of the lab. Those types of tips can just help you make connections faster and help you out on your test to make sure you have enough time to answer each of the questions. Practice distinguishing between each of the methods. In the rest of the chapters in your social psych book, they will frequently reference different studies that are talking about whatever factor it is causes this other factor. And so we can determine that that is from an experimental study rather than a correlational design. So really practicing looking at how people are reporting those types of things, and how we know what each one of those is. So spend a little bit of time practicing identifying those differences between the methods. And this last tip is actually something that I did in my undergraduate career that really helped me out a lot. It's to make a cheat sheet table for yourself. We're going to go through one of the examples that I made on the next slide, but it is best if you kind of fill out your own and generate your own examples for what each one of those could be. So this is what mine looks like. I've got my type of design up here at the top, some characteristics of the design so that I know if I'm reading a new example that's given to me on the test, I can sort of go through and identify which one of those are most closely fits. What can I conclude? This is really important because this would help me determine if it's causal or if it's not causal, or if I can just look at what the population is describing. And then also I generated an example for myself over here on the last column. So if we're going through this one, my first is observational here. I'm describing a behavior or attitudes in only one population. So that's again, like if we were going back to that music store example, how do people behave in public places? And from this type of study, I can really only conclude descriptions of the population. So for example, a type of observational finding that might be reported in the media is, say, 67% of Tinder users are dissatisfied with their current relationships. That's kind of a bleak thing that I just made off the top of my head, but you know what I'm saying. That's describing the population without really looking at the relationship between two variables. And an example here is the researcher does a survey of incoming freshmen at Tech and concludes that 81% of them plan to ride the bus to campus. So I'm not really looking at the relationship between any two variables, I'm just describing that population. Next is the correlational design, and that's looking at a non-causal relationship, and again I bolded non-causal because that's very important, between two variables. So we're looking at how two variables are related. Here I like to look for words like relationship or correlated. Relationship can actually refer to either a correlational or an experimental relationship, but most of the time if they're using relationship, it goes with correlational. And so my example here is eating Cheerios in the morning is positively correlated with riding the bus. Cheerios don't cause riding the bus, and the bus rides do not cause the Cheerios. So I made this little note to myself here that we can't really conclude causation from this at all, and it could be bidirectional if we are concluding any sort of relationship. So bidirectional meaning the Cheerios don't cause bus rides and the bus rides don't cause Cheerios. My last example here is the experimental design, and here I'm describing the causal relationship between two variables. So here is what we use this all the time in psychology because we really want to know what's causing what. And this is sort of the gold standard of all designs. So here we're looking at how two variables are causally related. We like to look for words like causes or leads to or influences or something like that. And my example here is actually from a real research study. Telling about a friend about a long-term goal causes people to be less likely to achieve the goal than people who kept their goal to themselves. So if you want to think about this in terms of your own life, maybe it's better to not share your New Year's resolution with your friends, but who knows? So that's what that finding is suggesting. And again, my key word here is causes. Okay, so these are 3 of the different types of methods that were explained in your book. But my recommendation, again, would be to continue filling out this chart because there are ones that I didn't mention here. And generating your own examples and thinking about your own examples of how all of this fits together. All right, I think that's everything that I have for today. But please let me know if you find these videos helpful or if you want to see any other specific examples. Please email me and let me know. I will post it for the whole class and I will make sure that I explain whatever it is in more detail.